The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden rays over the sprawling courtyard of an ancient palace. Tourists from all corners of the world milled about, snapping photos and marveling at the intricate carvings on towering stone walls. The air buzzed with chatter, excited voices blending with the occasional honk of a distant car or the clatter of footsteps against cobblestones. Amidst this lively scene stood Marcus, a young guardsman dressed in a crisp uniform that shimmered faintly under the fading sunlight. His polished boots gleamed, his posture was ramrod straight, and not a single hair on his head seemed out of place. Marcus had been stationed here for 2 years now, guarding one of the most iconic landmarks in the city. To many visitors, he might as well have been part of the architecture, a statue come to life. Children often pointed at him, giggling and daring each other to touch his shiny helmet or tug at his sleeve. Some adults joined in too, testing whether he'd flinch if they waved their hands inches from his face. But Marcus never moved. Not once. It wasn't just discipline. It was pride. Every day, he reminded himself why he wore the uniform: to honor tradition, protect history, and serve as a symbol of strength and stability. On this particular evening, however, things felt different. A group of tourists stumbled into view, loud and boisterous, clearly having spent hours sampling local drinks at nearby bars. They laughed raucously, their words slurred and exaggerated. One man stood out among them, a tall, broad-shouldered fellow named Greg. With his unkempt beard, rumpled shirt, and swaggering gait, he looked like someone who thrived on chaos. As they approached the palace gates, Greg's sharp eyes landed on Marcus. At first, he squinted, tilting his head as though trying to figure out what, or who, Marcus was. Then, without warning, he burst into laughter. "Look at this guy," Greg bellowed, jabbing a finger toward Marcus. "Is he real? Or is this some kind of wax figure?" His friends chuckled nervously, unsure how far Greg would take his antics. But Greg wasn't done. He stepped closer, circling Marcus like a predator sizing up its prey. "Hey, buddy," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You got a pulse. Blink twice if you're alive." Marcus didn't blink. He didn't even breathe differently. Inside, though, his patience was wearing thin. He'd dealt with rude tourists before, those who poked fun at his silence or tried to distract him. But there was something particularly grating about Greg's tone. Still, Marcus held firm. This was his duty, and nothing, not even a drunk stranger, would make him waver. Greg grew bolder when he realized Marcus wouldn't respond. He leaned in close enough for Marcus to smell the alcohol on his breath. "What's wrong, soldier boy?" Too scared to talk. When Marcus remained silent, Greg let out a theatrical sigh. "Fine, then. Let me check if you've got a brain under there." Without hesitation, he raised his hand and smacked the top of Marcus's helmet, making a hollow thwack sound echo through the square. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even Greg's friends fell silent, shocked by his audacity. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Marcus's gloved fists clenched ever so slightly at his sides, but otherwise, he showed no reaction. His training kicked in, reminding him of the rules. No matter what, he must stay still. Yet beneath the surface, a storm brewed. This wasn't just disrespect. It was humiliation. And while Marcus couldn't act now, he knew one thing for certain. Greg would regret crossing him. Greg's slap echoed louder than he'd expected, the sharp sound slicing through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. For a moment, even he seemed taken aback by his own audacity. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, some stifling nervous laughter, while others looked genuinely uncomfortable. But Greg wasn't the type to back down, especially not when fueled by liquid courage. Instead of apologizing, or even pausing to consider what he'd just done, he doubled down, grinning ear to ear as if he'd just pulled off some grand prank. "Wow, you really are a statue," Greg barked, throwing his arms wide in exaggerated amazement. No reaction at all. "I bet you're not even human." He turned to his buddies, who were now inching slightly away from him, perhaps sensing that things were escalating too far. "Come on, guys, don't you think this guy deserves an award? Best actor or something?" The crowd around them began to shift uncomfortably. Some tourists snapped photos, whispering behind their hands about how disrespectful Greg was being. A few locals frowned deeply, their disapproval evident. One elderly woman muttered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Such arrogance. This is why outsiders give us a bad name." But Greg didn't care. If anything, the attention only emboldened him further. He circled Marcus again, inspecting him like a curious child examining an exhibit at a museum. "You know what?" Greg said, pointing dramatically at Marcus. "I'm gonna call you Statue Guy. Yeah, that's your new name. Statue Guy." He laughed uproariously, slapping his knee for emphasis. Then, leaning closer once more, he added with mock seriousness, "Hey, Statue Guy, do you mind if I borrow your hat? It looks kinda heavy. Bet it'd make a great souvenir." Still, Marcus didn't move. Not a muscle twitched. His face remained impassive, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed the faintest tightening around his eyes, a subtle sign that the storm within was growing stronger. Inside, Marcus's thoughts raced. He replayed the moment over and over. The sound of Greg's palm hitting his helmet, the jeers, the mocking tone. Each second felt heavier than the last, but years of training kept him rooted in place. He reminded himself repeatedly of the rules. No reaction, no matter what. To retaliate would mean failure, and yet the urge to act burned fiercely inside him. Greg, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath Marcus's calm exterior, decided to push things even further. He grabbed his phone and held it up, pretending to take a selfie with Marcus in the background. "Hey, Statue Guy, smile for the camera," he shouted, laughing hysterically when Marcus naturally didn't comply. Greg posed dramatically, sticking out his tongue or flashing ridiculous faces, while Marcus stood rigidly beside him. After a few moments, he lowered the phone and smirked. "Man, this guy's got zero personality. What's the point of standing here looking fancy if you can't even crack a joke?" By now, the crowd had grown larger, drawn by the commotion. Some watched in disbelief, shaking their heads at Greg's behavior. Others recorded videos, capturing every cringe-worthy moment. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking why the man wouldn't stop teasing the guard. Through it all, Marcus endured silently, his resolve unwavering. But deep down, something shifted. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about respect. Respect for his uniform, his role, and the countless hours he dedicated to serving with honor. As Greg finally staggered away, still chuckling and boasting about how easy it was to rattle a soldier, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Greg and his friends stumbled off, their laughter fading into the distance, Marcus remained rooted to his spot. To anyone watching, he appeared as calm and composed as ever, a picture of discipline and professionalism. But beneath the surface, his mind was racing. The echo of Greg's slap replayed in his thoughts like a broken record, each memory igniting a fresh wave of anger. Yet, alongside the anger was something else, a quiet determination. Marcus knew better than to let emotions dictate his actions. He had spent years mastering self-control, learning to channel frustration into focus. And now, more than anything, he needed that focus. Marcus thought back to his training days, when instructors drilled one rule into every recruit above all others. No reaction, no matter the provocation. It wasn't just about maintaining appearances, it was about upholding the dignity of the uniform. The guardsmen weren't ordinary soldiers. They were symbols of strength, tradition, and respect. To lose composure would tarnish not only themselves, but also the legacy they represented. Breaking this rule meant risking everything Marcus had worked so hard to achieve. His comrades depended on him, and his unit's reputation rested on their collective ability to remain steadfast. But tonight, The line between duty and personal pride felt razor-thin. Greg's actions hadn't just been disrespectful. They'd been calculated to humiliate. The slap, the taunts, the staged photos, all of it was designed to strip away Marcus's authority and reduce him to nothing more than a prop for Greg's amusement. And while Marcus couldn't deny the sting of embarrassment, he refused to let it consume him. Instead, he began to think strategically. There had to be a way to restore balance without crossing the boundaries set by his role. As the minutes ticked by and the crowd dispersed, Marcus's mind turned toward possibilities. He recalled stories shared among fellow guardsmen, tales of clever comebacks and subtle lessons delivered to those who tested their patience. One story stood out vividly. A senior officer once dealt with a similar situation by orchestrating a harmless yet humiliating prank that left the offender red-faced but unable to complain. The key, Marcus realized, was precision. Any response had to be perfectly timed, meticulously planned, and most importantly, within the limits of acceptable conduct. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, but Marcus found comfort in its clarity. He reminded himself why he chose this path: to serve with honor, even when faced with adversity. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about teaching a lesson. Respect wasn't something to be demanded. It had to be earned, and sometimes it had to be taught. As his shift neared its end, Marcus allowed himself a small private smile. Greg might have thought he'd won, but Marcus knew better. The game was far from over. All he needed was a plan, and a little help from trusted allies. When Marcus finally stepped away from his post later that evening, his resolve was steelier than ever. He didn't know exactly how things would unfold, but one thing was certain: Greg wouldn't walk away unscathed. Whatever happened next, Marcus vowed to handle it with the same precision and poise that defined his role. After all, true strength wasn't about lashing out. It was about striking back in a way that left no room for doubt. After his shift ended, Marcus walked briskly to a quiet corner of the barracks where he often met with two of his closest comrades, Liam and Diego. Both men were seasoned guardsmen who shared Marcus's dedication to duty and mutual respect for tradition. When Marcus arrived, they could immediately tell something was off. His usually calm demeanor carried an edge tonight, his jaw set tighter than usual. Without needing to ask, Liam handed him a cup of strong tea, giving him a moment to collect his thoughts. Marcus recounted the evening's events in detail, sparing no emotion as he described Greg's taunts, the slap, and the crowd's reaction. "He didn't just insult me," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "He disrespected the uniform. He made us all look weak." Diego nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in thought, while Liam clenched his fists, clearly struggling to keep his own temper in check. "We can't let that slide," Liam said finally, breaking the tense silence. "But we have to be smart about this. If we break protocol, it'll reflect badly on everyone, not just you." Diego leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What do you want to do? We're here for you, Marcus. Whatever happens, we've got your back." Marcus took a deep breath, his mind already working through possibilities. "I don't want to break the rules," he said firmly. "In fact, I want to use them to our advantage. Greg thinks he's untouchable because he humiliated a statue. Let's show him statues can fight back, in ways he won't see coming." The three men huddled closer, their voices dropping to hushed tones as they began brainstorming ideas. They knew Greg's type: arrogant, careless, and prone to boasting. Earlier that night, before the incident at the palace gates, Greg had loudly declared his plans to visit the famous fountain later, a massive ornate structure known for its dazzling water displays. It was a popular spot for tourists to take photos, especially after dark when the fountain lit up with colorful lights. The trio decided this would be their stage. "Here's what we'll do," Marcus explained, sketching out a rough plan. "We'll make sure Greg gets soaked, not directly by us, of course, but in a way that looks accidental. There's a maintenance panel near the fountain that controls the water jets. if someone trips the system at the right time. He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Liam grinned. And we just happen to know some people who work maintenance. A quick word, and they'll schedule a routine check around the same time Greg shows up. Diego chimed in, adding another layer to the plan. We'll blend into the crowd, dress casually so no one suspects anything. When Greg starts posing for pictures, we give the signal. Timing is everything. If we pull this off, it'll look like bad luck, not retaliation. As the pieces fell into place, Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring balance. Greg needed to learn that actions have consequences, even if those consequences came wrapped in irony. By using the environment and sticking strictly to the rules, they could deliver a lesson he'd never forget, all without leaving a trace. By the time they finished hashing out the details, dawn was creeping over the horizon. Exhausted but determined, the three men shook hands, sealing their pact. Tomorrow night, the fountain would become the backdrop for Greg's downfall, and Marcus, ever the disciplined soldier, would ensure justice was served, not with anger, but with precision. The next evening, the air buzzed with anticipation as Greg and his friends made their way to the famous fountain. True to form, Greg was louder than ever, cracking jokes and boasting about how epic his night had been so far. His phone was out, capturing every step of his journey like some self-proclaimed star of a reality show. The group approached the fountain just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the area in a soft glow illuminated by twinkling fairy lights strung around the plaza. The fountain itself stood majestic in the center, its waters shimmering under multicolored spotlights, drawing crowds of tourists eager to capture the perfect photo. Unbeknownst to Greg, Marcus and his comrades, Liam and Diego, were already in position, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Dressed in casual clothes, they looked like any other bystanders enjoying the lively atmosphere, but their eyes were sharp, scanning the scene with precision. They exchanged subtle nods when they spotted Greg swaggering toward the fountain's edge, clearly planning to strike a pose for yet another selfie. Everything was going according to plan. Greg positioned himself dramatically near the water, one foot resting on the stone ledge encircling the fountain. He struck what he must have thought was an impressive stance, flexing his arms and grinning widely at his phone screen. His friends snapped pictures from different angles, laughing and teasing him about his model moment. Meanwhile, Marcus signaled discreetly to Liam, who casually wandered closer to the maintenance panel, hidden behind a decorative hedge nearby. Diego stayed close to the fountain, pretending to admire its beauty, while keeping a careful eye on Greg. When Greg leaned farther over the edge for a better shot, Diego gave a slight nod, a nearly imperceptible cue that set the final stage of their plan in motion. Liam, now standing beside the maintenance panel, pressed a button labeled Routine Check. Instantly, the calm rhythm of the fountain transformed into chaos. Water jets erupted violently from beneath the surface, sending arcs of water shooting high into the air. The sudden burst startled everyone, but Greg bore the brunt of it. Standing precariously close to the edge, he lost his balance and tumbled backward into the shallow pool surrounding the fountain. His phone flew out of his hand, landing with a splash inches away. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Greg flailed, soaked from head to toe, his once cocky demeanor replaced by shock and embarrassment. For a moment, there was silence. Then laughter erupted. Tourists doubled over, pointing and giggling uncontrollably as Greg struggled to climb out of the fountain. His friends weren't much help. They were too busy recording videos and snapping photos, clearly torn between concern and amusement. Water dripped from Greg's hair and soaked his clothes, making him look more like a drowned rat than the confident man he'd been moments earlier. Marcus watched from a short distance, his expression neutral but his eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. It had worked perfectly. The timing, the execution, everything. To anyone watching, it appeared to be nothing more than a freak accident, a random malfunction during routine maintenance. No one suspected foul play. let alone involvement from the very guardsman Greg had mocked the night before. As Greg finally managed to scramble out of the fountain, dripping wet and clutching his ruined phone, Marcus stepped forward. Still dressed in plain clothes, he offered a hand to help Greg up. For a split second, Greg hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. Then, reluctantly, he accepted the gesture, allowing Marcus to pull them to his feet. As their eyes met, Marcus leaned in slightly, speaking softly so only Greg could hear. "Respect costs nothing," Marcus said, his tone icy but controlled. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Greg stood there, drenched and humiliated, staring after him in stunned silence. Around him, the laughter continued, mingling with the splashing water of the fountain. And somewhere deep inside, Greg realized this wasn't just bad luck. It was a message. As Greg stood there, dripping wet and utterly mortified, the laughter around him seemed to grow louder. Tourists who had been quietly admiring the fountain moments ago were now doubled over in fits of giggles, pointing at him and snapping photos without a hint of shame. Some even cheered mockingly, as though his tumble into the fountain was part of an impromptu performance put on for their entertainment. His friends weren't helping either. They were too busy recording videos, laughing so hard they could barely hold their phones steady. One of them shouted, "Greg, you're going viral," which only made things worse. Greg tried to brush it off, forcing a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, hilarious," he muttered, shaking water from his hair like a dog trying to dry itself off. But deep down, he felt exposed, humiliated in front of strangers who would likely forget his name but remember the image of him sprawled in the fountain forever. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on him, and for once, his usual bravado faltered. And then there was Marcus, standing a few feet away, still holding the calm demeanor that had become his trademark. Marcus offered Greg one last chance to salvage some dignity. He extended his hand again, not to help Greg up this time, but as a gesture of finality. It wasn't an apology or an olive branch. It was something far more powerful. It was respect. Respect earned not through words, but through actions. Greg hesitated, staring at Marcus's outstretched hand, as if unsure whether to trust it. Finally, reluctantly, he took it. The moment their hands touched, Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that only Greg could hear. "Respect costs nothing," he repeated, his tone colder than before, yet oddly measured. There was no malice in his words, just a quiet authority that cut straight to the bone. Greg froze, his face flushing red, not from embarrassment this time, but from anger mixed with something else. Was it guilt? Shame? Whatever it was, it hit him hard. Marcus didn't linger. As soon as he released Greg's hand, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as effortlessly as he had appeared. To anyone watching, he looked like just another bystander leaving the scene. But Greg knew better. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Marcus had orchestrated the entire thing, down to the timing of the water jets and the perfect delivery of his parting words. And what stunned the most was that Greg couldn't argue about it. There was no proof, no smoking gun. All he had was the sinking realization that he'd underestimated the very person he'd mocked. His friends finally stopped laughing long enough to notice Greg's expression. "Dude, are you okay?" one of them asked, slapping him lightly on the shoulder. Greg shrugged them off, muttering something under his breath about needing fresh air. He grabbed his sopping wet shirt and wrung it out, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The crowd began to disperse, satisfied now that the spectacle was over. Phones were tucked away, and conversations returned to normal. Yet Greg remained rooted to the spot, staring after Marcus's retreating figure. For the first time in years, Greg felt small, really small. He had spent his life bulldozing through situations, relying on charm and bravado to smooth over any cracks. But here, in this foreign city surrounded by strangers, none of that mattered. His jokes fell flat, his confidence crumbled, and his arrogance was stripped bare. Worse still, He couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus had handed him a lesson wrapped in irony, a reminder that respect wasn't something to be demanded or taken lightly. It had to be given freely, or it could be taken away just as easily. By the time Greg finally moved, shuffling awkwardly toward a nearby bench to sit down, the fountain plaza was almost empty. The lights reflected off the water, casting shimmering patterns across the ground. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed again, unaware of the storm brewing inside Greg. He pulled out his ruined phone, sighed deeply, and muttered to himself, "This place is crazy." Little did he know, the real craziness wasn't the fountain. It was the man who had turned his own hubris against him. The next morning, news of the fountain incident spread like wildfire. Security cameras had captured the entire scene: the sudden eruption of water jets, Greg's dramatic tumble into the pool, and the chaotic aftermath. Someone had uploaded the footage online, and within hours, it went viral. Social media platforms were flooded with memes and captions mocking Greg's misfortune. One post read, "When you think you're the main character but turn out to be the punchline." Another quipped, "Tourist vs. Fountain. Fountain wins." The video racked up millions of views, turning Greg into an unwitting internet sensation. Back at the palace headquarters, whispers about the incident reached the ears of Marcus's superiors. While many found humor in the situation, after all, who wouldn't enjoy seeing arrogance get its comeuppance? There were also questions. Had Marcus crossed a line? Even though nothing outright illegal or explicitly against protocol had occurred, some higher-ups worried that his involvement might reflect poorly on the guardsman's reputation. A formal inquiry was called, and Marcus was summoned to explain himself. Sitting across from the stern-faced officers in their polished office, Marcus remained as composed as ever. He recounted the events leading up to the fountain incident, emphasizing how he had adhered strictly to the rules. "Sir," he said calmly, "everything that happened can be explained by coincidence. The fountain malfunction coincided with routine maintenance checks, a procedure documented weeks ago. My actions afterward were simply offering assistance to someone in need." To support his claim, Marcus provided evidence: maintenance logs showing the scheduled check, witness statements confirming the crowd's reaction, and even footage proving that he had been dressed in plainclothes during the event. The officers reviewed everything carefully, searching for any hint of misconduct. But there was none. Every detail aligned perfectly with Marcus's explanation. In the end, they had no choice but to accept his account, albeit reluctantly. "You're walking a fine line, guardsman," one officer warned, his tone firm but not unkind. "While we commend your discipline and creativity, remember that perception matters. We trust you'll continue to uphold the values of this institution without leaving room for doubt." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Understood, sir. I acted within the boundaries set for me and ensured no harm came to anyone involved. That remains my priority." Though officially cleared of wrongdoing, Marcus received a minor reprimand, a slap on the wrist meant to remind him of the importance of discretion. To outsiders, it may have seemed like a blemish on his otherwise impeccable record. But among his fellow guardsmen, the story took on a different tone. Word of Marcus's clever retaliation spread quickly through the ranks, earning him a mix of admiration and playful teasing. Some joked that he should teach a class on strategic payback, while others simply patted him on the back, calling him a legend. Locals, too, celebrated Marcus's quiet victory. Many viewed Greg's public shaming as poetic justice, a reminder to tourists to respect local customs and traditions. Vendors near the fountain began selling T-shirts printed with slogans like, "Don't mess with the guards," and "Respect costs nothing," capitalizing on the newfound fame of the incident. Parents used the story to teach their children about humility and consequences, often pointing to Greg's viral video as an example of what not to do. As days passed, life returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such a spectacle. Marcus resumed his duties at the palace gates, standing tall and stoic as always. Passers-by occasionally gave him knowing smiles or subtle nods, acknowledging the role he played in teaching Greg a lesson. Tourists still snapped photos, but now there was an unspoken understanding. These guards weren't just statues. They were guardians of dignity and honor. For Marcus, the experience reinforced why he loved his job. It wasn't about power or glory. It was about protecting something greater than himself. And if delivering a little harmless justice helped restore balance, then so be it. After all, sometimes the best lessons are the ones that leave everyone laughing, except the person who needed to learn them most. Greg left the city the next day, his tail tucked firmly between his legs. He didn't stick around to see the aftermath of his viral fame, or the endless jokes circulating online. His friends tried to laugh it off, saying things like, "Hey, at least you're internet famous now." But Greg wasn't amused. Every time he opened his phone, he was bombarded with notifications, comments mocking his fall, memes exaggerating his tumble into the fountain, and videos replaying the moment in slow motion for maximum effect. Even back home, the story followed him. Friends who hadn't seen him in years messaged him just to ask, "Weren't you the guy who got dunked in that fountain?" At first, Greg tried to brush it off, pretending it didn't bother him. But deep down, it gnawed at him. The laughter of strangers echoed in his mind long after he'd closed his eyes at night. He replayed the incident over and over. The slap, the water jets, Marcus's icy words. That final phrase, "Respect costs nothing," haunted him most of all. For someone who prided himself on being fearless and untouchable, Greg had never felt smaller. It wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the realization that he'd been taught a lesson, and everyone but him seemed to understand it. Meanwhile, life in the city moved on as usual. Marcus returned to his post outside the palace gates, resuming his role as a silent sentinel. To tourists passing by, he looked exactly the same as before, unwavering, dignified, and unshakable. But those who knew about the fountain incident couldn't help but steal glances at him, their expressions tinged with curiosity and admiration. Children still pointed at him, but now they whispered stories about how he outsmarted a rude tourist without breaking a single rule. Locals nodded approvingly when they walked past, silently thanking him for standing up, not just for himself, but for them too. The fountain itself became something of a local legend. Vendors nearby capitalized on its newfound fame, selling miniature replicas and postcards featuring the iconic structure. Some even added captions referencing Greg's misfortune, like "Step lightly," or "You might become part of history." Parents brought their kids to visit, using the site as a teaching moment. "See that fountain?" they'd say, pointing to the shimmering waters. That's where a man learned that respect matters everywhere, even on vacation. For Marcus, the experience was both humbling and affirming. He had always believed in the importance of discipline and restraint, but this incident reinforced why those values mattered so much. It wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about protecting the integrity of his role and reminding others of the shared responsibility we all carry to treat each other with decency. As days turned into weeks, Marcus found himself smiling faintly whenever he heard someone mention the fountain. He didn't need recognition. Knowing he'd done the right thing was enough. As for Greg, the lessons came slowly, but they did come. Back home, he avoided talking about his trip altogether, deflecting questions with vague answers or changing the subject entirely. Over time, though, he began to reflect on what had happened. He realized that his behavior hadn't just embarrassed him. It had disrespected an entire culture. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he started making changes. He began listening more, speaking less, and paying closer attention to the world around him. When friends teased him about the fountain, he forced a laugh but secretly vowed never to repeat the mistakes that led him there. In the end, the story of the drunk tourist and the stoic guardsman became a tale passed down through generations. Locals told it to visitors as a cautionary reminder. No matter where you go, respect is universal. And while Greg faded into obscurity, Marcus stood tall, a living testament to the power of patience, discipline, and quiet strength. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't won with loud declarations or dramatic gestures. They're achieved with calm resolve and a steadfast commitment to doing what's right.